Welcome to Chatham House and to what I am certain will be a very interesting and lively discussion, and certainly one that's highly relevant to multiple issues in contemporary international politics today. I'm Leslie Vinjamuri. I direct the US and Americas program. And I should say, before I introduce our topic and our speakers, that we are on the record tonight. And we hope very much that this will be a very engaged conversation and that all of you will speak your questions as much as possible. But when you do, please be aware that, that you are on the record and probably being recorded. The topic is part of our new series on democracy in the United States in global perspective. For those of you who have been joining us over the last many months, you know that we had a series on the US elections and foreign policy priorities. We've now moved on. It took us a long time in America to move on from that election, but we have confirmed a result and we have inaugurated a new president. So now we are looking at many things, but one of them are a number of questions surrounding democracy in the US. Tonight's discussion this afternoon, for those of you in New York, is clearly looking far beyond America's borders, but the initial impetus for the conversation was, of course, the decision to remove the United States president from Twitter, which, as we all know, had been perhaps the most important way in which he communicated directly with the American people and with most of the world throughout the 4 years of his presidency. So that decision was one of a great deal of significance and consequence. And it fed into this much larger and more long-standing debate about social media regulation, not only Twitter and Facebook, but many other mediums as well. We at Chatham House, not myself, but many of those, some on the call, Harriet Moynihan and Marjorie Boucher and others, and our new Academy Fellow have been doing some very serious research on this, but we are joined tonight also by two speakers from New York City. And I'm really looking forward to their interventions. Our first speaker, Professor Jack Snyder, is well known to anybody who's ever taken an international relations class, studied human rights, nationalism, ethnic conflict, the First World War. He is the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Relations at Columbia University. He's written many books on the subjects that I just mentioned. He has a forthcoming book on human rights pragmatism. And recently, the trigger for me insisting that he speak on this particular topic, he's published an article in American Purpose just a few days ago. And I think the title was something very provocative, like "The First Amendment is not a suicide pact." So that gives you a sense, perhaps, of where he's going to take us. He will be followed by Suzanne Nossel, who I consider a friend of Chatham House because she was part of the Lloyd George study group on world order, which was one of our centenary projects led especially by the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. Suzanne is currently the Chief Executive Officer of PEN America. She's the author of the recently published book, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. That might give you a sense of where she's coming from, but maybe not. Suzanne was previously the COO at Human Rights Watch, the Executive Director at Amnesty International USA. And in the first term of the Obama administration, she was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations. So we certainly have a distinguished set of panelists to speak to us tonight. Jack, I know over the course of your thinking and scholarship and many books on nationalism and ethnic conflict, you've frequently talked about the role of the media and the manipulation of the media in stoking ethnic violence and conflict and setting back transitions to democracy. So you bring a lot to the table, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. I should say for the record that Jack was also my PhD advisor and many times co-author. So this is a very special event for me as well. Over to you, Jack.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Leslie, and for giving me this great opportunity to present my ideas in front of a panel that is chock full with real expertise and depth on this subject. You mentioned my work on human rights pragmatism. One of the dimensions that I've been interested in is pragmatic ways to solve the problems that are emerging with freedom of speech. So the invasion of the US Capitol has triggered a lot of soul searching on that subject, since many people are convinced that it was lying and incitement on social media, indeed on many forms of radical right media, that spurred that disastrous event. There's a clash, however, with the free speech absolutism that many Americans, at least, are prone to. Typically, Americans will agree with Justice Brandeis that if there's a problem with free speech, the solution has to be more speech, not censorship. I think that this ambivalence regarding the regulation and management of speech and media is standing in the way of proven measures that enhance both the moderation and the freedom of speech. After all, the First Amendment includes provisions guaranteeing both the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. And I think it's not an accident they're mentioned together, because I think those two freedoms are inextricable if free speech is actually to function in the way that the founders had in mind, to serve as a support for the Constitution and sane politics of our republic. So I think that it's really important to empower journalists and editors not to censor speech or to censor participation in public media, but to shape the forums in which speech is conducted. In other words, to make decisions about what news is newsworthy, to make decisions about who should be invited on the major big audience platforms, to sit there as they debate the issues and ask tough questions and call people out when their facts are wrong. Shaping the forum on major platforms, I think, is going to be the silver bullet that reconciles free speech with the regulation of speech in a way that gets rid of the lying and the incitement that has led us down a disastrous dead end. I think that this needs to be probably backed up with some kind of arm's length regulatory oversight by the government. So we know this can work on internet platforms that have mass participation. When Wikipedia started out, it was basically run by volunteers who participated with very little oversight or regulation, and it was filled with errors and controversy. If you went on Wikipedia and wanted to learn about the Armenian genocide, you would find that what it said would change from day to day, from hour to hour. It was an anarchic battlefield. Wikipedia, over time, changed its policy. It hired more paid editors. It established a vetting and validating process for trusted volunteers. And as a result of that self-regulation, Wikipedia is now the place that you are directed to on the web to correct mistakes that are brought in by radical, lying, inciting posts elsewhere, for example, on YouTube. So regulation can work even when you're talking about voluntary mass participation. So there's resistance to this kind of management or regulatory approach based on 7 myths. Let's see if I can do 7 myths in 4 minutes. The first is the myth that freedom of speech means having the right to an audience of millions. No, until the last few years, having an audience of millions always meant going through the press, including the judgments about the press, about newsworthiness, and the forum in which discussions would occur. We don't have an unregulated space on social media. It's already regulated by the algorithm. So the question is not regulated or not. It's a question of whether it's to be well regulated by professionals, namely our friends, the journalists, or regulated badly by the algorithms. A second myth is that regulation means censorship. No, it doesn't. Journalists shouldn't be in the business of censoring content. They should be in the business of managing and structuring debate. People can say anything they want to when they go on the PBS NewsHour, but Judy Woodruff is there to say, wait a second, that's not right. The facts are. People worry also that if there is serious regulation of discourse on the big platforms like Facebook and Twitter, that it will drive radical extremist opinion into the dark web, where their conspiracies will become even crazier and more threatening of violence to the republic. But I think that although this could be a problem, I think there's a different problem, which is perhaps more important. That is not the extremist behavior, but the casual consumer of news. Back in the 1950s, everybody in the United States watched the same 3 television networks for their news. They broadcast at the same time. So if you didn't want to hear it, you actually had to turn your TV off. This created a kind of consensual environment for information. You could get crazy radical pamphlets from the John Birch Society, but almost nobody did because it was too much trouble to find them. Instead, you just listen to whatever Walter Cronkite had to say. We know from the way authoritarian regimes dominate the high ground of the media, the national television, whether we're talking about Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia, or whether we're talking about Putin, they know they don't have to dominate every last little newspaper or low-powered radio broadcaster in order to dominate the national conversation. Okay, that's my 10 minutes. I'll work in my other 4 myths in the course of the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not going to ask you any questions right now. There are lots of questions that come out of your comments, but I'm going to go straight to Suzanne Nossel for your comments. Suzanne.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Professor Snyder's made a sort of ringing case for regulation, suggesting that its opponents are misguided, short-sighted, or stuck in the past. I have sort of a different take. I'm in agreement when it comes to the urgency of dealing with the ills of online content. But I think jumping to the idea that regulation is an unqualified good, particularly without specifying what precise regulations would be enacted, where, by whom, and with what aims, runs serious risk of being ineffectual, yielding unintended consequences, or even backfiring entirely. I am not against regulation, but I don't think banging on the table to demand regulation is likely to cure what ails our discourse. The internet regulation debate requires us to hold several different conflicting notions in our head simultaneously. One, that online speech can do serious harm. Two, that intrusive government control over social media poses risks. And three, that aggressive policing of speech by social media companies bears its own perils. One, the harms of speech. Speech can absolutely do harm, and those harms have been magnified immensely by the power and the nature of online platforms. Free speech defenders have traditionally been hesitant to recognize harms in the offline world because for fear that doing so would open the door to censorship, but they're undeniable in the digital realm. You know, I would spotlight the top three categories as online harassment, which we know has lasting psychological and even physical effects, and is also a threat to free expression in that its targets, where overwhelmingly women and people of color, are often forced online just to escape death threats, doxing, and other forms of abuse. Second category, disinformation. You know, we've had two incredibly powerful examples over the last year on pandemics and in our politics, and seen the proximate risk these can cause to public health, democracy, and other social goods. And then third, relatedly, divisive vitriol that's fueling polarization and violence. So the risks are clear, but there are also risks of government intervention. I don't think we should just cast aside why it is that we have a First Amendment in the United States or the protections for free expression that are enshrined in international law. These were motivated by a drive to counter the propensity of governments to exercise their controls over speech in self-serving ways. Even if we feel a measure of confidence that our current government would regulate wisely, do we feel the same way about a future government or, for example, in the United States, our recent past government? Even if certain Western governments exercise regulatory discretion wisely and with restraint, we see examples in Poland, Pakistan, the Philippines, and elsewhere of how precedents concerning online regulation are adapted to suit the purposes of repressive governments aiming to stifle dissent, manipulate election outcomes, and extend social controls. And third thing to recognize, the perils of aggressive content policing by platforms. The crux of the regulatory debate is focused on the social media platforms and how we can get them to exercise greater control over the ways in which harmful content seems to metastasize through their channels. Platforms do moderate content robustly. There are reams of standards and guidelines that govern what they do. Each company commits to and is obligated to follow the law in the jurisdictions in which they operate. And alongside that, they have their own elaborate self-defined red lines. Yet the problems with social media content policing are manifold. And it's not just that they're insufficiently aggressive in doing so. As profit-making companies, Facebook, Twitter, and Google carry out mandates in self-serving ways. They rely on artificial intelligence and machine learning that makes mistakes. They depend on underpaid armies of human moderators that also make mistakes and are often mistreated. They reflect the biases of their owners. They rely overwhelmingly on user flagging to determine what content may violate a trigger, creating perverse incentives whereby political, ideological, and personal vendettas can determine what content ends up policed and removed. A vivid illustration of just one of these problems is the standoff that's unfolded over the last week in Australia between regulators and Facebook that led Facebook to remove all news content, and even not just news content, but public interest content, information about fire prevention and pandemic controls in order to protest the government's attempt at regulation. I think we cannot underestimate the platform's propensity to thwart the public interest if it interferes with their corporate objectives. So keeping all of that in mind, the next pressing question is what kind of regulation we would advocate and how it would measure up against those considerations. Would it mitigate the harms? Would it protect against politicization and government overreach? Would it temper the platform's worst tendencies? Jack's proposal, as I understand it, seems to turn social media into kind of a version of state-run media where journalists would oversee all the traffic on social media. And I think that's sort of an unhelpful to my mind, conflation of the platforms with traditional publishers, treating them like they are newspapers or magazine publishers. And this was a dilemma that was confronted 25 years ago in the United States with the passage of this notorious Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is the blanket immunity from liability that internet platforms enjoy. And at the time, there was a dilemma about whether platforms were more like publishers or more like telecommunications companies. If the New York Times printed advocacy of an unlawful conspiracy, they could be held liable. If Jack and I were to plot a conspiracy over our Verizon cell phones, the phone company would never be held responsible. So internet platforms bear characteristics of both entities. They host user-generated content like a telco, but that content is often public rather than private and lasting rather than ephemeral, so like a publisher. Another big difference is that publishers edit, whereas telcos do not. In adopting Section 230, regulators in the US decided they didn't want to disincentivize publishers from intervening to moderate content and, for example, remove illegal content from their platforms by holding to a rule that in so doing, by behaving like a publisher in that sense, they would be performing an editorial function that planted them squarely in the zone where they could be held liable for content that was unlawful. So this immunity was extended to platforms. And I think a correct recognition that they simply do not and could never function as publishers. And just the mere volume of content that, with over 2 billion users a day on Facebook, the idea that you could equip enough journalists to read every post and determine what deserves to stay or go, I think is just unmanageable. And maybe there's a different vision that Jack has. And I look forward to talking about that. Just a few other points. One is sort of on this question of unintended consequences. I thought the Wikipedia example was interesting, but the most sort of foremost regulatory proposal under hot debate right now in the US is pulling back Section 230, this blanket waiver of liability, and introducing the idea that platforms should be held more responsible for user content that is posted on their services. And Wikipedia strongly opposes this. The Wikipedia senior manager for public policy has said if we were to live in a world where there is no Section 230, that changes things drastically. You'd see a lot of platforms being much more hesitant to allow users to publish things without any vetting. It would expose, for example, the Wikimedia Foundation to a lot more potential liability. It would actually just be a punishing amount of risk. And other observers have commented that paring back Section 230 could put Wikipedia and other services like the Wayback Machine online out of business. The question to flag is, what speech are we regulating? We've talked about harassment, disinformation, partisan vitriol. All of that in the United States, or much of it, is legal, as in protected by the First Amendment. Our government couldn't suppress it. In Germany, one of the jurisdictions that has been most aggressive in online content regulation through its NetzDG law, the premise is that the country's broad prohibitions on hateful speech must be enforced by the platforms under penalty of stiff fines. But even there, the speech swept up by the law is a tiny proportion of problematic content online. I think Facebook got only 8,000 complaints in 2019 and Google about 600,000. So a huge amount of the content that disturbs us is not illegal. And the portion that would be considered illegal here in the United States is far smaller because of the First Amendment. And so there are all these gray areas of content that trouble us and can cause great harm and yet are not illegal. So under what authority would that content be regulated? And in an area like defamation, if platforms can be liable for anyone who defames another, they would need to evaluate every critical post about someone before it could be put up. And that is done for book manuscripts, for example. It's extremely cumbersome and expensive. And when you contemplate sort of the volume of content on social media, it's quickly clear that I think the argument that's made that reintroducing intermediary liability for defamation could end the internet as we know it. I'm not sure that's so far-fetched, given what I think the platforms would have to do in order to protect themselves if they didn't have that immunity. So last point I'll make is that I think we're all increasingly coming to grips with the idea that what is most problematic in these online platforms is, almost not even the content itself, but the algorithms that take those conspiracy theories and rather than sort of allowing someone to share them with a small group of followers, dictate that the most explosive and incendiary views become algorithmically turbocharged to reach mass audiences. And how the algorithms select and elevate content is opaque. It's a secret that platforms sort of protect with their lives as core to their business models. But until we can crack that open, I worry that efforts to regulate content risk only tinkering at the edges. I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you, Suzanne, and to Jack before I come to Harriet and then open it up. And I'm going to ask you one specific question because we do want to get specific. Was the decision to take Trump down the right one, and should he be allowed back on Twitter and Facebook? Suzanne, you first, and then we'll come to Jack.
Yeah, I think the decision was justifiable. I had actually written a piece about this very issue in the fall of 2019 when Kamala Harris argued that Trump should be kicked off Twitter for comments he had made at the time. And I argued against it on the basis that we were coming into an election season. I thought the public sort of had a right to hear and see the president in this unmediated form. I actually believe that might help temper support for him. And there's some evidence that it did. There's some polls that show that the president's tweets undercut his support among this crucial block of sort of suburban voters that turned away from him and helped to elect Vice President Biden. I also think that the kind of partisan outrage, through the election cycle about the removal of one candidate, of a sitting president from the platform, while a contender to replace him remained active and vocal, would have, led to, a kind of turbocharging of the right wing's war on social media. I mean, there was an effort to, an investigation initiated by the White House about partisan bias based on very little. But I think that those claims would have been energized and sort of the bitter vitriol would only have been fueled. I think the calculus changed after the election, though, honestly. I mean, first of all, the kind of direct urging of violence and spurring of conspiracy theories in the wake of the polling and the president's refusal to accept the results of the election and intimations that he was not going to leave office. So I think that's one part of it. I think the other piece was that, look, the public wasn't on the verge of a decision, this crucial, absolutely essential political decision. And so I think the value of being able to hear the president out, which, in my view, probably hurt him as much, if not more than it helped him, was lessened at that point.
And coming back on, bringing him back on, did you want to say a word on that before I come to Jack? It's the hard question.
That's sort of, let me turn it over to Jack. I feel like I've said enough. I don't have a long, I don't want to hear from him again. But the other thing I think that bears noting is, and then that I've also said in relation to the Facebook Oversight Board, is I think it really is important what principles are articulated to explain this decision. I mean, I have my own ideas that applied in that post-election period, but it is a decision that is going to have global repercussions. Alexei Navalny expressed really strong concern about how that precedent could be used to silence someone like him. And we're sort of watching that happen in different ways right now. And so I think while none of us sort of are eager to see the president resume his Twitter feed, I think we really have to think hard about what is the principle that would exclude him at this point. I think they do have some kind of lifetime bans, and maybe he's met that threshold.
Jack, I'm sure you have a response to Suzanne and also to this question before I come to Harriet and Marjorie and many others.
Yes, I think that Trump should not have unmediated access to an audience of millions and millions of followers. But then I think that anybody who has access to an audience of millions and millions of followers should automatically be vetted and perhaps mediated as the situation requires and is appropriate. However, I do want Trump to have access to an audience. I just want it to be buffered and mediated, shaped and controlled by highly professional journalists of diverse views politically, but people who all stick to professional standards of journalism. So for example, I want Trump to go on the PBS NewsHour. And before Trump talks, I want there to be a contextualizing background segment, carefully crafted by professional journalists. And then I want the professional journalists to ask him questions the way they do to anybody that they interview. And if Trump answers in a way that doesn't comport to the normal practices of being interviewed on TV by a journalist, they either pull the plug, they talk over him, and or they just don't invite him back because he's not playing by the rules. If there's someone appropriate for Trump to debate, they should have the usual kind of point counterpoint. What do you think? Trump said, how would you respond? Sort of treatment. So yes, Trump's audience of millions of supporters or just curious people should be able to listen to Trump, but in that kind of journalism mediated setting.
And we'll leave it to the technology experts to work out how you implement that. Harriet Moynihan is our senior research fellow on the International Law Program here at Chatham House. She has written on this specific issue and done quite a lot of research over many, many years in her career at the Foreign Office and at Chatham House. So Harriet, over to you.
Thank you, Leslie, and hello, everybody. And thanks to Jack and Suzanne for for setting this conversation up so well. Jack, I very much agree with you that we shouldn't be shy about regulation. I think there is a need for regulation in this space. But Suzanne, I think you're absolutely right that we have to be very careful about regulation, and there's certainly no one size fits all, because although there are a lot of different political systems and there's a real risk of over-regulating. And I think this social media regulation topic is an incredibly difficult one. How do you balance freedom of expression against the need to protect against online harms? How do you deal with lawful content that is harmful at the same time? And how do you address disinformation, including your granny sending some misinformation inadvertently versus a government that is using disinformation as part of an influence campaign? And where are the limits of persuasion and lawful influence? So a lot of these questions have been looked at for some time, and governments and tech companies have been wrestling with them. But I think what's hopeful is that we're starting to see some governments and some international organizations, the EU, come out with some really interesting proposals that I think provide a bit of a model, which the US I know is looking at. And it would be interesting to hear from you, Jack and Suzanne, the extent to which you think there is a dialogue between the US and the EU on this. So if I may, I just wanted to spend a minute just highlighting, I think, some of the advantages of the way the EU and the UK are approaching this. And the first point is that they adopt a kind of co-regulatory model, which is essentially a government coming out with its own regulation, but it's backed up by the self-regulatory models that tech companies themselves have already come up with. And in the last few years, there have been a number of policies, and I'm sure that those on the call will be aware of some of the measures that platforms have taken to try to address some of these harms. Now, they may not be perfect and they may not be enough right now, but we know about labeling policies, we know about hate speech policies, community guidelines, civic integrity policies. And I think in combination with a regulator, an independent regulator who oversees and looks out for those policies, monitors them, it's quite an interesting idea about multi-stakeholderism, which is the way that we need to approach this, because this isn't about governments anymore. We're talking about a global internet. And I think the second feature, which is really interesting about the EU and the UK, is a kind of systems-based approach. So rather than focusing on the content, individual pieces of content, and getting bound up with particular debates about content or hate speech or what should be taken up or kept down, the approach is about regulating the business model, which Suzanne has so sort of eloquently explained is part of the issue. The use of algorithms to amplify particular content. And the systems-based approach is essentially one that looks at the processes and policies of these tech companies to ensure that there's much greater transparency and greater accountability, that these companies need to do their due diligence to identify the risk of human rights harm and then work out how to mitigate it. And of course, a lot of the social media platforms are trying to do that already. But the role of a regulator is to really scrutinize the policies and procedures against international human rights law standards, essentially, to check whether they are going far enough. And if they're not, then they get asked to be more transparent about how they use algorithms, or to implement a better, fairer accountability mechanism so that users can kind of have a remedy. And so the emphasis is away from, as I say, particular pieces of content, and it's about a sort of systems-based, risk-based approach, which aims to be proportionate, because the obligations that are imposed on these companies are differentiated according to the size of your company and the size of the operation. Now, I'm not saying that this model over the other side of the pond is perfect. It's at a very early stage. And the good thing is it's going to be scrutinized in detail by the European Parliament and the UK Parliament this year. And no doubt the US will be watching that as a kind of testing ground whether this kind of model might work. Because ultimately what we need is a sort of global, coherent regulatory approach, rather than lots of different countries coming out with their own approach, given it's obviously a global internet. So I suppose if I may just tack on a question at the end, and my question is about regulatory coherence, I suppose, and the extent to which the US is watching what's going on in other countries. There's been a number of other measures put forward, for example, by Australia, as we've seen in recent months and weeks, and by Ireland. To what extent is the US watching and looking at these things? And although obviously the US has its own issues and its own political dimensions to navigate, the Biden administration will no doubt find that quite difficult. Is there a dialogue going on between the US and the EU on these issues? And to what extent could the EU provide a model, or at least a source of inspiration for some of these issues? Thank you.
Great set of comments. Let me take Simon also, then come back to Suzanne and Jack, and then I have Marjorie from Chatham House, Jessica from the BBC, and then we'll come back out again. So Simon Burkett.
Hi, thank you very much for a great session. Content's extremely important, as we've heard this evening. I've got over 40,000 followers on Twitter, and have been tried to follow sort of prospectus standards in what I say, and quite often when I try to advertise those tweets, I'm not allowed to do it, even though the engagement rates can be over 20%. But my question is not on content, it's actually more about the way in which we're being enveloped. And my question is, should we be paying more attention to the way that technology platforms are continually asking us to add more data, devices, channels such as apps and desktops, location services, and even family members to our accounts that we hold with them to envelop us? Is this something we ought to be paying more attention to, and the regulator should? Thank you very much.
Great questions and comments from Harriet. Shall I come back to, who would like to go first, Suzanne or Jack? Suzanne, I'll let you go first.
Sure. I mean, on the question of sort of US-EU coordination, I think it's been useful that the EU and individual countries have been sort of ahead of the curve in trying some of these things out. My own view, honestly, is that there's going to be a period of trial and error. One of the most difficult parts of this is just we don't know how various kinds of regulation would play out in practice, and whether regulations would prove to be enforceable. On the question of transparency and algorithmic transparency, they will resist that tooth and nail. And so how do you make it enforceable? What will it take? How intrusive do you have to be? I think those are, unanswered questions that we're only going to figure out over time. And so I think moving ahead, experimenting, NetCG, I think was sort of turned out to be a bit more of a whimper than people expected. I think the evaluation is certainly not complete, but that's an important experiment to look at. Some of these efforts, one issue we haven't really touched on, but that I think is a crucial part of the equation is the way in which the rise of these internet platforms has hastened the demise of local news. We've done a huge report, I'll put it in the chat, on that issue in the US called Losing the News, where you've seen the emergence of these news deserts all across the United States, of small, medium-sized, even large cities that have lost their newspapers and news outlets, and there's no investigative reporting, there's no journalist at the State House or the governor's mansion watching what is going on and holding our officials accountable. And so it's a huge democratic deficit. It has also fostered the rise of disinformation in the absence of credible journalism. And there have been a few attempts, one in Spain and now this one, getting so much attention in Australia, to essentially try to force the platforms to pay for news. Because the reason that the local news has dried up is all the advertising revenue from classified ads and those, full page ads we used to see a decade ago. All that has been sucked away to Google and Facebook, and they do not pay for news content. And so there are these regulatory efforts to remedy that. But in Spain, what it did, it just backfired. When the companies were forced to pay for news, they just deprioritized it algorithmically, and the news organizations lost all of the traffic that they were getting from page views that originated on internet platforms. And it was disastrous for them, and it was pared back. And so, it's sort of just illustrative of, what terra incognita this really is. And I think, how little we know about how some of these, even very sound and well-reasoned proposals may play out in practice. I do think there's coordination, and I think it's going to be stepped up under the Biden administration, undoubtedly. I think people recognize these issues are global. They're also curious what precedents and approaches are working, what lessons learned we can derive from other jurisdictions. On the second question about sort of, what I think of as kind of the mass surrender of privacy, I think absolutely. I mean, it is, those efforts to get us to turn over all kinds of information are increasingly aggressive. The costs and downsides of doing so are so sort of abstract, and hard to parse that, we're raising a generation that doesn't think twice about, giving over everything because they want to be on a new platform that allows them to communicate with friends and post videos and do other things that they want to do. And I am not sure what it's going to take to reverse this, because even the mechanisms, we're now all clicking more buttons to accept cookies and things like that. But, if I'm any illustration, I'm impatient. And so I'm just clicking, to get what I want faster. And I think we really have to think hard about sort of how we're wired as human beings and what it will take to sort of rebalance this complete surrender and forfeiting of privacy that, has been inaugurated in the digital age.
Thank you, Suzanne. And over to you, Jack. And Jack, I just also want to interject one quick comment, which is why, the number that you throw out, X number of million, it's a little bit arbitrary. So can you just say something about your thinking on, why is it the number? Because presumably if you're speaking to, 1,000 really dangerous people and spreading this truth, that's as bad as speaking to 4 million not dangerous people. Or it's different, but why the number? Where's your logic on that, in addition to the two?
So it only takes a fairly small number of people to take their guns down to the mall and attack the US Capitol. And so that small number of people might fall through the cracks, especially if they're not on Twitter and Facebook, but they're on some, weird site that you've never heard of and don't even imagine. I'm assuming that those people are the less dangerous threat to the Republic. because they can be arrested. The millions and millions and millions of pro-Trump voters who think that the election was stolen and still would vote for Trump as president despite everything, those are the people that I worry way more about. And so this goes to my point about holding control of the media high ground, but not worrying so much about censoring every last political statement that's false or dangerous. So the most systematic study that I've seen of how misinformation and rumors circulate in the media, at least in the US these days, the studies by the Harvard team led by Yochai Benkler. And what he shows is that left-wing extremists and right-wing extremists in the United States generate just about the same volume of conspiracies on any given day. But what happens to those conspiracies in the left progressive media discourse circle is very different than what happens on the right. On the left, crazy conspiracy theories get put forward, and then because they're not picked up by the New York Times or PBS or NPR, they die very quickly. On the right, Benkler and his compadres show these crazy conspiracy theories get rolling, and then they're picked up by Fox News and the former president of the United States. And there's a ratchet effect. More and more people hear about them. The conspiracy theorists, generators get more excited and double down on their conspiracies. So my point is that it's the control of the media high ground, whether it's Fox, the New York Times, Facebook, Twitter, that determines the degree of misinformation of a dangerous kind that's believed by the average person in the country who goes out and votes. That's why the numbers matter. Exactly what is the right number where you switch from algorithmic control of bad speech to handcrafted vetting control of bad speech, I think depends on the type of speech, whether it's political or just some personal nastiness, but it also may depend on the nature of the platform. And so I have no idea what the answer is to the right number. Do I have a minute to talk about the intrusiveness of government?
Yes.
So what I would be for would not be intrusive government regulation, European style. What I would be for is something closer to the traditional US fairness doctrine from 1949 to 1987, which was very arm's length, just pretty much said, you have to have active, balanced coverage of contemporary issues from diverse points of view if you want to have your license to be a broadcaster, or in this case, a broadcaster and a platform. Now, exactly how that would be implemented for each platform, I think could be very different. It could be, to some extent, the choice of the platform, whether it mostly wanted to do it with an oversight board like Facebook has, whether you mostly wanted to do it by hiring professional journalists to do your news feed and to interview the loudmouths that want to reach their audience through your platform. But but it also, you might want both of those things, because the oversight board might be best for dealing with personal harassment, data privacy, random hate speech, or is our algorithm for Aunt Harriet's post tuned quite right? But you might want to hand over the news issues just to your board of journalists, and these should be highly professional journalists with diverse views, not only in terms of left and right, but also they should be world journalists. They should be journalists from Indonesia and Egypt and Beijing, in addition to London and New York.
It was great, thank you. Marjorie Boucher, who's leads our Digital Society Initiative at Chatham House, and then Jessica Cecil at the BBC, who I will leave to introduce herself because she'll do it much better than I will. Marjorie.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you to our panelists for a very rich discussion. What struck me, and it's what Suzanne said very eloquently, is that obviously this is quite a new field that is still fast evolving, and we're still grappling with some fundamental questions, such as who has the legitimacy to regulate online content that by definition is quite transnational, but also what action can we take? And I think Jack very eloquently as well mentioned that freedom of expression is not freedom of speech, and there are many more actions that could be taken than simply censoring or taking down individual from platforms. Now, I just have a few questions related to, I think, what was bubbling up in on this field and in the debate recently. The first one being about the oversight board, so Facebook sort of Supreme Court of Justice for online content, so to say, and what our panelists think about this entity, because there's not really a precedent in terms of what they're trying to do. What is also, I think, very interesting is that they've taken some of the first decision and they overturned 4 out of 5 cases. So in 80% of the time, identifying Facebook decision as not the right one. And what's your take on that? So that's my first question. The second one is related to the Australian case and this call to pay news outlet, that Google, Facebook and others should pay the news outlet that provide content on the platform. Now, I think what is interesting with that debate, it has been highlighted that, well, paying journalism through the platform may not always be the best option, because in the case of Australia, it would actually feed the big Murdoch and sort of journalistic outlets, and does not necessarily contribute to media pluralism as we wish it could. So my question is, do you think this decision of having big platform pay for news is a good one and would work in the US, or if actually you would recommend other mechanism there?
Thank you, Marjorie. And Jessica, I know you're doing some very interesting work at the BBC in this area, so it would be great to hear from you, Jessica Cecil. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. What a fantastic debate, really, really interesting. I'd like to suggest that there may be another model for consideration as part of the solution to disinformation, and that's the cooperative model. I run something called the Trusted News Initiative. It is an alliance of the 4 major US tech platforms and some of the biggest news publishers in the world. What it represents is effectively a global fast alert to the most serious disinformation that we come across on all of our platforms and across that we find, to commonly agreed standards. And those standards are immediate threat to life, an immediate threat to the integrity of the electoral system, and imposter content, i.e. content that pretends to come from a trusted news organization that doesn't. It's a break glass moment, the report in, so it's a very high materiality bar, but it does meet the 3 really fascinating challenges that Suzanne lays down, in the sense that it doesn't fall into any of those problems. And it would be interesting to hear from all of the panelists whether you feel that actually that might be part of the solution to disinformation alongside regulation and the other things that have been discussed.
Thank you. And I have to say, I hope this becomes part of an ongoing conversation, because I think there are a lot of people on the call who have a lot to bring to the table. I'm going to take one last question from Lori Dundon before I come back to the two panelists, Lori and then.
Hi, sorry, I'm just going audio rather than video. Very quick. Given the model, which will require regulators to really work with tech companies on evaluating regulatory proposals, regulatory compliance, it still requires a degree of technical capacity on the government side of the equation. How do we build up that bureaucratic capacity? I know there's a lot of folks looking at putting that forward, but for example, if a government team has 1, 2, 3, or 4 persons, and we're trying to engage with tech companies that have full departments, keeping pace with not only the tech advances of today, but what's coming ahead, so that we're not that we can build up enough government capacity to not just chase yesterday's problems. So I'm just wondering if there's any good ideas bubbling up on the European side of the ocean, on the US side, if anyone has any ideas or has heard anything coming up to address this.
Actually, I'll take one more from Carolina, since she's joining us from Argentina, our Academy fellow who's working on many of these issues. Carolina, would you like to add your question?
Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, so I had a comment and a question. Sort of following Jack's point, Facebook has set up a partnership with the International Fact-Checking Network to demote content that's deemed false, and also to offer links to fact-checked information on the news feed. So, you know, again, sort of supporting Jack's idea, I think this has been sort of a means to bring journalists into content vetting to social media. But, you know, for sure, as Suzanne mentioned, I think it's probably not enough due to the sheer volume of information that's being shared on social media. And then I did have a question for, I guess, Jack and Suzanne. Suzanne, you mentioned that the Biden administration is keen to regulate social media. We've already seen a bill proposal put forth by the Democratic Party in February. It's the Safe Tech Act. So I was wondering whether you think that intermediary liability is likely to be redrawn under the Biden administration.
So you have lots of questions and comments. We're going to go a few minutes over. This is sort of your opportunity to engage with those which you like, and then call time for those that you don't want to answer because you're not sure what you think. But Suzanne, we'll go with you first, and then we'll come to Jack before we finish. But this is really a great set of interventions and questions.
Yeah, no, great questions. Just kind of quickly, I'll try to touch on most, if not all of them, but on the Facebook Oversight Board, you know, I think it's sort of a promising step so far. I wrote a piece about it that I'll put in the chat before they issued their first decisions about sort of, you know, what I think it will take for them to sort of demonstrate their bona fides. But I think, you know, their engagement with international human rights law, this sort of detailed explication of decision making, you know, that can over time create a body of precedent that can be analyzed by researchers and the public. I think that's a positive step. I think the glaring gap is something I touched on in my remarks, which is, you know, the real problem, I think, to a large extent, is the algorithms. And so the jurisdiction of the board, which seems to be confined to individual content determinations rather than, whether the harms inflicted by the algorithms can and should be corrected. I think that's a serious limitation that if the board is to be credible, they're going to have to try to find a way to overcome. You know, is paying for news, forcing the platforms to pay for news a good idea? I think it is, although I think we have yet to figure out exactly how to make that work without these, you know, secondary side effects that backfired in Spain, or, you know, what you raised in terms of, lining the coffers in Australia of the Murdoch empire. You know, I think the goal would be to drive revenue, particularly to local news sources that provide this sort of essential democratic function at the local and regional level. the Trusted News Initiative, I had a question back for you, which is, well, did it pick up on, all this conspiracy mongering ahead of the Capitol insurrection? I quickly Googled and saw it only seemed to come together in early December. So maybe your answer would be, it wasn't fully functioning enough to do so. And I think that's really the test is, I think it's a positive initiative. I don't think it's a comprehensive answer from what you said, because, as you said, sort of for break the glass movements, and a lot of these problems are much more kind of grinding and incremental. But, I think all of this experimentation and multi-stakeholderdom, it's part of the evolution of how we ultimately as a society get our arms around all of this. So I look forward to hearing more about it and seeing how that works and what it can contribute. In terms of the important issue that Lori raised, how do government regulators get up to speed? It's getting better slowly in the US. I mean, there were sort of these embarrassing congressional hearings a few years ago where you've had heads of the tech companies, and it was just, patently obvious that members of Congress had no idea how these platforms worked, and were drawing analogies to, media types, that were decades old. And I think there has been a big effort over the last few years to try to climb up that expertise curve and bring in people. I would draw the analogy to sort of the financial sector, where, we've built up these very sophisticated financial regulators, in the US and the Securities Exchange Commission and other agencies. I think it can be done. You may need to change pay scales so you can attract the right level of talent, and that's been done in the financial sector. It's a big investment, but I think I see that in the future. Last question in terms of the Biden administration, Section 230. It seems that way. It seems like there's going to be some sort of paring back. I don't think it's going to be, even though Vice President Biden during his campaign came out in favor of repeal, my guess is we will see some type of reform rather than wholesale repeal. And I just, since it's my closing, want to say how much I enjoyed this discussion and appreciate your having me here.
That's great. I just wanted to see if Jessica wanted to add anything by way of response before we come to Jack. In part, and the reason I come back to Jessica, because my ambition really is to make this an ongoing conversation, and I'm guessing that the two of you have not met before this roundtable. So.
We haven't, and Suzanne, I would love to talk to you more about it. You're absolutely right. It's not comprehensive, but it is experimental. And I think picking up what Jack said at the beginning, in what are the practical solutions that we can try and work towards and see what works and what doesn't in what you called terra incognito. So I'd love to pick this up with you.
Jack, the floor is yours.
So let me say a little bit more about my notion of how the government regulation would work in concert with the oversight boards, the journalists, the platforms, and broadcasters. So I'm imagining that the government regulation, at least in the US context, would look something like the old fairness doctrine. It could be either statutory or it could be FCC regulations, preferably statutory, but we'll see. And it should be a pretty loose set of guidelines involving fairness, comprehensiveness of coverage of important information, as well as a kind of vague list of concerns like data privacy, harassment, hate speech, or whatever your list is. And then this would be guidelines within which the broadcasters and the platforms would be expected to work. And they would be expected to come up with some system of oversight, including things like the oversight board, perhaps leaving it open, like who appoints members of your oversight board, but perhaps being a little bit more directive X percentage of the people on the oversight board appointed by the company, X percentage by the government, X percentage by nonprofit organizations, X percentage distinguished experts on the topic like David Kay and Suzanne Nossel. They should be on every oversight board, I think. So then they should also have to write an annual report to the FCC on the ways in which they are trying to comply with these fairness doctrine regulations. And then, you know, at some point, the FCC could say, or whatever sub-body they designate, could say, no, we don't like the limitations that you've put on your oversight board. They're just calling balls and strikes, but they're not talking about the rules of baseball. So this isn't good enough. Give us another plan. And the journalists, you know, likewise, the FCC could quibble about, these are not real journalists. There are not enough third world journalists on your list, or whatever the complaints. And then they would have to respond. You know, what the sanctions would be, I have no idea. On Section 230, I kind of like Section 230. It seems to me to be not very productive to allow individuals to bring lawsuits against platforms, especially if you have an alternative of a regulatory structure where people can appeal to the regulators and say, please make the platform have a better algorithm and protect my data. And then the conversation is not just in the rigid confines of a court of law, but is in this regulatory conversation back and forth.
Jack, thank you, and Suzanne. And I should also say thank you to Harriet Moynihan, our senior research fellow, Marjorie Boucher, and Carolina, and Jessica Cecil from the BBC, and Simon, and everybody who's really made some really great interventions. I certainly have taken quite a lot away in terms of, you know, not only how complex the problem is, but, you know, the solutions are there's a lot of room for innovation and contestation and productive engagement, because it clearly is still very new terrain, which I think is stating the obvious to those of you who are deeply engaged. I would recommend to all of you to take a look at Suzanne's new book, Dare to Speak. I'm sure there's a lot worthwhile there to follow PEN America, to follow Jack's writings, and especially to follow the work of my colleagues at Chatham House who work on these topics. And I do hope that this will be part of an ongoing and very productive conversation, because it would be a shame if it weren't, given how high the stakes are for, you know, if we can, regrounding the mainstream middle, as Jack put it, of media. I'd rather we also don't let the bad guys go, but I'm sure Jack would like to have them arrested as well. So thank you very much. And we will hopefully see you, I think, next week or the week after, to talk about the future of the Republican Party with a couple of Nick Lehman, I think, and Jack's colleague from the journalism school, and Theda Scotchpole. Lots there to discuss, not least because Donald Trump is giving his first return speech on Sunday. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.